I now move on to the next talk that we have. This is by Professor Enamul Haque. Inamda and I first met in 1998 in a similar, not in EC mode, but in a resort where Inamda came with his family, a young son. I think he was about 4 years old, 2 years old. He was just barely walking around, but his name is Riddo. He is today a young man working for Google, and we've seen over the years Riddo grow as Inamda kept coming back for different meetings. And one of the things about the Sandy Network is the friendships that we build. And it's been great, opportunity for me to have built on this friendship with Inamda. And like Maniji said, over the years, not only have we met as citizens from two different countries, we've started to work together, and we've done a fair bit of work which brings together South Asian research into some kind of cohesive whole. And so it gives me great pleasure to introduce Inamda. Inamda is a professor of economics at East West University. He's the director of the Economic Research Group and the executive director of the Asian Center for Development in Dhaka. He has been, a member of the Sandy Steering Committee, the Advisory Committee, and he's also a member of the South Asian Network for Environmental Law and Policy. He is probably one of the most prominent economists in Bangladesh today, and is extremely popular not only among students in his own university, but I think people from all across Bangladesh show up at his door. And those of us who've known him, the best time to catch him is in the evening. He works late hours, and he has been an advisor at large, not only to people who are his advisees, but for those who are seeking any kind of assistance in terms of their Sandy and non-Sandy research. So please welcome Professor Enamul Haque. Inamda.
Good morning, everyone here, as well as those who are online. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak here today. This is mostly sharing a research that we did, and we realized that other issues need to be tackled in order to solve some of the issues that economists are asked to address. So that is what I'm going to share. But let me also recognize the contribution of Kalyan Meller, who was dear to us. He has been for Sandy. What we are here partly because of him and Professor Partha Dasgupta. So we recognize him and recognize him personally for that. And I still remember when my son was very young, and I remember we were traveling in Bangkok, and Riddo was with him whole day. In fact, he was at that time 5 or 6 years old. Anyway, this is a work that I must also say that Pranab was partly involved, Maniji was partly involved. We are all partly involved as a South Asian team. And the reason was that there is a pressure from, at least with the sustainable development goal policies, governments around the world are trying to understand SDG from a macro perspective, not from a micro issues. And when it comes to macro perspective, they're asking for readjusting the GDP for environment. And that is one of the issues that comes. And economists, as environmental economists, like many of us, we are mostly deal with micro issues. So this particular problem came to us to understand how can we do it. Not that it is new, but as we are working, we realized that there is a different strategy required, at least to address some of the issues. So I'm going to describe some of the way we have done the work, partly, and also I'm going to explain the challenges as well as the understanding that I have, so that I think researchers can take up in future. Just the keyboard? Okay, thank you. So Again, I'm going to borrow. I borrowed from different literature just to set the ground for it. This is how the relationship, if we look carefully, the earth and the atmosphere, if you think about it, and the people, and the way economy, ecology link us. So earth is a big asset. It has all the kinds of resources, and it provides major three services. The first one is basically crops, our provisioning services. We all know about it. Second one is the regulatory services that we all know about it. And third one is a cultural services. And eventually, when we go to GDP, our objective is to go back and see what is ultimately the economy and how the welfare is changing. And at the same time, there's a cyclical effect back to the earth. And so the question of sustainability needs to be measured. That is the way that it's supposed to be measured, which GDP does not come up. So that's why the adjustment is required. So obviously, if we look carefully, there is a need for resource accounting. And here, as we were working, I realized that the term accounting and probably economics are not necessarily same, but then we use in GDP accounting, which is an accounting framework, but there is a lot of economics behind the scene. So here is also the same. The framework that is known as SIA, so which is System of Environmental Economic Accounts, and the accounts has been approved, at least standardized by UN Statistical Department in 2012. So, and there has been a lot of books already published. So if you are interested in any of the items, it's almost a significant number of books. SNA 2008 is the base for the GDP accounting framework. Those who are working on macro, that is the starting point. Then we have the SIA 2012, and SIA 2012 has two frameworks. One is a central framework, and one is an environmental economics, ecological framework. So there's two framework. And then there is now working on the ocean accounts, biodiversity accounts. There are works going on. That's why it's still not done. But they have separately SIA water accounts. So in other words, if you're working on water, how to bring water into the system of national accounts, they have a separate book for this. They have an energy accounts, and they have also a forestry and fisheries accounts. So these are all the accounting framework that they have created. In fact, they are now working on because cultural values are very important. So there is a tourism account separately being worked on. So as we work in a micro information, eventually these are supposed to be add up to the macro. So they have created a whole system for that. In terms of the economy that we look in GDP, the objective that we all familiar with, particularly those who are economists, that we are looking at production, consumption, accumulation, export, import, that is the basis of it. But the environment is a much larger frame that we are fully aware of it. And we have the stocks this is where the stock account comes, minerals, land, soil, timber, these are and all of them. And then there are flows. So we derive materials out of it, energy, water, and ecosystem services. And all of them interact with each other. In other words, economy has linked with the flows. We also do protection and mitigation services to protect nature. So that is another investment type of it to the nature that we do. And our objective is eventually to bring all of them into the system of national accounts. So the task we were engaged was actually, it's not that there's anything new here. The task we were engaged is, can we design a strategy to make these kind of activities into national accounts of Bangladesh? That was the task that we were assigned to. And as I said, the perspective is the first test was the asset and resource perspective, where I look at timber, water, forest. And the second one is ecosystem perspective, which is looking at lake, forest, cropland, wetlands. So there is two different perspectives. And then SIA central frameworks and environmental accounts together, they're supposed to create a macro frame. This is where the central framework is designed for. So as we started working and we realized that the two systems are linked to two different kind of researchers. One are natural scientists who are working on it. And natural scientists collects a lot of data. Their perspective is completely different than we do. Second issue that we realize that, and at least my realization, is that all the services, I think previously Arun also mentioned about it, all the services are also interlinked. If you reduce forest and we say there is a loss of tourism, it's not enough. There is a significant loss of different services, and it has linkages to the water. So eventually the full economy-wide linkage is important, rather than looking at one small micro aspect of it. Most of us are comfortable working on micro aspect of it, but when we want to integrate it, I think that's where we were lost. Why we were lost? Because current accounting system, and this is something let me also go back a little bit. I was in a meeting with the ocean accounts team, and after 2 days of meeting with the scientists, we realized that the scientists were discussing about the ocean and trying to understand how many fish stocks are, how much fish stocks are there, what are the different kinds of. So it's more of a stock assessment. And when it comes to the economist, our objective is not in the sea, but outside the sea, coming to the landing ground where we receive final output. And the biggest trouble that when we want to link these two, almost like we're not talking to each other. They are working on their own, we are working on our own. And the system is basically looking at a partial view of the whole. So that is one understanding that I realized that we need to think through that how to integrate there, because as nature degrades, there are consequences on many other systems. So that is where the issue came to our mind as we are working on it. And the way I look at the economy is that most of our economic strategy is extracting as much services for us, which is mostly provisioning services. And as we increase our extraction of nature, as we push for more accumulation or more access to provisioning services of nature, the regulating cultural services decreases. So that's the balancing. That's where sustainability issue means that our GDP accounting, mostly looking at the provisional services, part of cultural services are there, but the rest regulating services is particularly, which is one of the major issue for protection of environment, is missing. And that is where I thought the biggest gap that exists. Most of the discussion that we do is around provisioning services. As I said, tourism activities, they are now coming up with. So if you look into this as a natural system, just from a perspective that as we convert forest into urban landscape, you can see how the value of the provisioning services goes up. But at each stage, different kinds of ecosystem services drops. So in other words, as we go from forest to planted forest, habitat services are almost gone. As we go from planted forest to pasture lands, many other biodiversity, soil protection, pollutant, so all these waste assimilation services are gone. So there is a decline of habitat services, of regulatory services, whereas we are increasing provisioning services. And that is what we realize, that how do we go about it? How do we find the values of these services to integrate with the national economy? So that was our biggest challenges that we fell through. So we had this, and just to give you some Bangladesh picture to understand, we were working on two accounts, forest accounts and water accounts. So our objective was, can we look into these two? And Forest Department has fantastic data set. They had 2000 and 2014 data set. And they were giving us idea that hill forest is declining, sal forest is declining over time. So they gave us these numbers. So forest accounts, forestry department is creating these numbers for them. But then again, what is the connection between this declining forest with the water retention, with the hydrological cycle? Nothing is there. And so we really don't know how do I integrate that value. That was our challenge as we were looking at. So one thing we did, So we had so just to give you a perspective on Bangladesh, as we said, if you look at Bangladesh, it's the land of rivers, technically. It's all wetland. So not really flatland, floodplain, but it's all wetland. In a small, tiny area, 150 plus rivers, going through each other. So and on the top of is some forest land. If you disturb the forest, it will disturb the river system. So that's how the interconnection. But as we were looking at it, we didn't find a lot of literature looking between these two lines and say, look, how do I do it? So this is where we started. We said, okay, maybe we should start to zoom in and see where we start, because our issue was water is a larger issue. So we said, okay, let's start with an expert consultation on the rivers, water and forest expert. Because first of all, it's not forest, it's not one forest. So can they explain the forest from a forest ecology perspective? And forest groups said that they actually look at Bangladesh forest into 4 different or 5 different groups. The first group is hill forest. We don't have mountains in Bangladesh, hill forest. The mangrove forest, which is on the coastal land. Then we have sal forest, which is in the middle of and then it is the planted mangroves, which is coastal afforested land. So they say these are the most forest, and the rest is village forest, but they classified as village forest is private forest at the household level. The question is, what are the services they receive? And they are not linked into one. So in other words, village forest is spread out everything. So forest department first told us, forget about the village forest now. Concentrate on the forest that we control and give us the services. So what are the regulating services out of this? So that was one of the first questions that we had. So we did a literature review, and this is also the same with the water wetland. When you talk to the forest water people, they said, oh, there are rivers, there are floodplains, which are also wetlands, because during one season it will become water bodies. There are permanent water bodies like lakes, and there are coastal brackish waterland. So they have all these different kinds of ecosystem. So we said, okay, first task, and this is a task that we divided up, said, okay, let us divide the forest and wetland into different kinds of separate, distinctive ecosystems. And that's when, as I said, like we needed the help of the foresters and water experts to do this. That was the first one. Second, we said, well, let's look into how many different kinds of habitat services, regulatory services these systems can provide. And unfortunately, we found out more than 80 different services from the literature. So we realized that, okay, if we want to do any study on 80 different services, that's almost another lifetime work. So it's almost impossible. Now, we were not asked to do any study. So we were asked to give them a strategy. So that's what our task was, limited by that. So what we did, we looked into how many values that economists has produced. Very small amount, only 5, 6 to 10 different kinds of values available that we could actually use for Bangladesh. So one issue that economists should look into is from a macro perspective, what are the, but the question is, which values economists should start looking at? Most of the values are provisioning values. The regulatory values almost absent, not much. And then there are 80 plus regulatory services we found out from these ecosystems, from the literature. So we decided that we will shorten the list as a researcher we do. And the best strategy would be to go for a survey on experts and see what type of services they believe are the most important services for these wetlands, so that we can concentrate on this. So that was the first task. So I'm just giving you the way we worked on it. So we created that, and we found out very interesting. So we had eventually 6 different types of ecosystem, which is, one is the rivers, which is wetland. One is the floodplains, which is also wetland, river water system. Then we have hill forest, which is intertwined with wetlands also, because fields are not without lakes. So that is there. Sal forest, coastal forest, and mangroves, which is Sundarban. And experts gave us the list of major services there. So one thing that we realized that, okay, major services are not all same. So when we want to find out ecosystem valuations or integrate it, we need to go by the ecosystems rather than by just say this service. And it is not particularly to and so within ecosystems, we found out that, for example, 8 different habitat services are very important. Regulatory provision, these are provisioning services. So they found out provisioning service of that. Let me go back to regulatory. Then we have regulating services. So whereas river ecosystem was providing 8 provisioning services, about 17 regulatory services. So there's a lot of other services the river system provided. Floodplains were providing about 14 different regulatory services. The hills about 9, salt forest about 9. Hills and salt forest are very similar. Coastal is about 7 and Sundarban which is about 8. This is again like a reducing from 80 to these numbers. And then we said, okay, now researchers should concentrate on these services first in order to integrate the evaluation, because without this, it is impossible. Cultural services, again, rivers, and you can see in Bangladesh perspective, just to give you an idea, the rivers are really major provider of other services outside the provisioning services. Floodplains are also major service providers. So these are almost like the lifeblood of the economy. And these services are linked to the provisioning services. So any reduction of these services will eventually reduce the provisioning services and will create problems in the economy. So this is one strategy we did. Now, as I said, provisioning services are much easier. We can do it. Our biggest trouble was to look into the regulatory services. Regulatory services, biodiversity conservation, we realized that people need to use research. And this is where my point is, when we look into biodiversity conservation, we should look into ecosystem based rather than a forest because it's all linked to this. So we cannot talk about biodiversity without water and forest together. So that is one issue. Genetic resources, again, people can use different methods. I'm not going into the techniques, but I'm just giving you the services that is more important. Water cycle regulation. We didn't really find much hydrological data at all. How the rainfall is linked to the recharge in a particular ecosystem, almost no data exists. So that is something we realized that, okay, you want to find a value of this, how, excuse me, how it will change, but we have no idea. We have no idea about that. So that is one. Climate regulation, very small amount of information available that how the quality of changes in the ecosystem would eventually lead to the changes in the climate regulation. Not a lot of data exists. And that is something that probably where I was pushing, and we realized that we need to work with the science group in order to deal with it. Moderation of disturbances, water flow regulation, soil erosion control, storm cycle protection, probably that is where the data is. Noise attenuation, waste assimilation. Some of the services we're talking about it. Cultural services, again, aesthetic values, some of the services, that is cultural tourism services do cover. But riverine community, forest community, the value of these communities in terms of cultural values is not there. Thank you. And some of the cultural and historical values. So these are the issues that we realize. Just to give you an idea, this is how the accounting system is set up for integrating with the national accounts. And the strategy is from the central framework, it is mostly from the forest resource and water resource issues. What they're asking for, that what are the changes happening, physical changes. So they do account for the physical characteristic changes. That's the first one. Then they chance to find out whether the changes, what is the opening stop, what is the closing stop, and what are the net changes happening, including if there are investment done. So it is year-to-year calculation. Ideally, idea is that between 1 year to the next year, like a GDP changes, how much changes happen in the stock of resources. So it's like a spreadsheet calculation that they do. Then the second one is the change between 2 years, how much change has been done. So they do the second matrix, which is the change matrix. But this is where, again, we realize that, interesting, a lot of this information are mostly scientist information. Chemical changes happening. And the problem with these, that it is at a particular point. And scientists make a lot of averages. Just to give an idea, I'm pretty sure we all know it. Rainfall is a very good example. Average rainfall or average temperature is actually simple average of the high and low. It's not the average of the day, the way we think about it. It's just looking at the high and the low and the average. That's how so scientists have created their strategy of doing it. So that's how, so they look into the indicators, and a lot of this information are missing. It really does not exist. Most of the data that happens in many countries is with a specific river, with a specific urban point. So country-wise, such kind of data almost absent. And this is where we have now asked the missing data analysis. In fact, we just did the missing data analysis, that this kind of data does not exist in Bangladesh, probably also in many other parts of this region. It exists only at one point. At one point means someone did a study and did in one point, that not as a regular interval. If you want to integrate with the national account, just like we do LSMS survey at a regular interval, just like we do household income expenditure survey as a regular interval to understand the changes in the human consumption, the similar changes nature does not exist. That is one of the biggest trouble that we have. The second biggest trouble we have, that they do measure sometimes 2 cycles. For example, best example is the forest department data. They had forest inventory survey done in Bangladesh at 2 levels, 2015, 2017. But the definition are different. So one data set cannot match with the other data set. So even though they had same names, forest inventory survey, but the data set are completely different. And in our region, and this is probably for us to take, it's all done by the needs of certain organizations. They said, this is what I pay for, so you do it. So from a national perspective, we don't have a regular system of collecting this information. And that eventually will say, look, it's impossible to do this. You can do a back of the envelope calculation, but it's not a real good calculation. So that's what we realize, that a lot of data does not exist. That's another one, forest condition, particularly looking at the ecosystem changes. That data is very low. We had, for example, red books of IUCN for understanding the endangered species, but that is also not regular. So as I said, like that was one of the biggest issue that I thought that when we were working on it, that somehow we work on our domain, scientists are working on their domain, but there is a need to discuss. And I think without this discussion and without what we need and without telling them this is what we're looking for. For example, I want to look into the soil quality data. We have soil quality data exist, but the data was always in a map, never been given in a number. So it's all in a map issue. So when we said, well, we need the numbers, well, there's no repository. The group who did this research gone. Another group came after 10 years, did another research, but the two data never correlated. So I'm giving you the problem that we have on this. Similarly, we will changes in the landscape. Probably Google has information on the certain urban areas. Yes. Okay. So these kind of issues that we realize that, okay, as we are working on our own, mostly working on micro information, I think there is a need for environmental economists, resource economists to move into macro issue, because that's a bigger challenge that is happening. On micro issues, we have some information, but on macro, we don't have a lot. And in a way, when we look into the environment, we think carefully that we have our economic activities, our push for provisioning services more to get from the earth is technically melting the Earth's other capacity. And our approach should be that we look into how the depletion, degradation eventually have changed on the health of the nature and how it eventually changes the economy. And that linkage has to be established. I'm not sure what is the best way to do it. Most of our analysis is partial. My take on it is more of a ecosystem-based modeling should be one strategy that economists should push for. That is what I'm thinking of. That I think there was once bioeconomic models. Economists used to work on it, dynamic models. But I think ecosystem-based modeling should be one of the strategies that I thought after working on this, we should push our mind to, and maybe we should think about it in future. That can we develop ecosystem-based modeling using the nature as a key ingredient to production and consumption system, so that we see the flow, stock and flow relationship. And this, for example, economists have been traditionally ignored nature for many, many years. Best example is when we say production function, our basic textbook economics is Q is a function of labor and capital. Resource is not technically there. It's capital which is pushing the whole thing. As climate change came, we realized that weather is part of the production system, and it requires long-term relationship on that. I think that is one issue that economists should start thinking about it. That's my realization. And probably more of a general equilibrium type integrated system. At least at the beginning, it should be ecosystem based, and then it should be integrated. That will probably give a better answer to the policymakers, because what policymakers are looking for is that there has been a big pressure on the economy to push for growth, and that is probably going to extract either water or other resources. What is the consequence of this on the sustainability? So a stopgap partial analysis is probably not going to do justice. So for economists, I think my suggestion is that we should gradually look into macro aspect of it and try to think carefully, said how do we bring them together? And that is one of the missing things, at least in environmental economics. There's not a lot of work on that. So I thought that this is an issue that I should raise in this forum. Thank you. Thank you very much.